Oh, goody.
All right, what's going on, everybody? Zombies here again, and today we're back with another Marvel Snap video. So in this one, we're doing a tier list, and this is going to be a little bit less conventional than some typical tier lists you normally see, where they do S, A, all the other letters, just on kind of card strength. And this is going to be focusing on just the pool 3 cards and kind of ranking the pool 3 cards to give you an idea of, hey, I just opened this pool 3 card, you know, is it good? Is it bad? Does it need more support? That's kind of what this tier list is aiming to accomplish, because there are a lot of powerful cards in pool 3, but some of them need more support, especially from other cards in pool 3, to really realize their full potential. So we're going to go through all the different cards here in pool 3. And before we do that, let's just take a look at the different sections we have of the tier list. At the top, we have a solo ticket out of early pool 3. Then we have cards that are the kind of defining cards in their archetype. Cards that are great and powerful on their own, that don't need support but can benefit from it. Cards that are very good when they get support. Cards that are kind of niche but still playable in certain decks. And then lastly, cards that are currently not really played at all in the current environment. So we're going to get right on into it here. Before we do, if you enjoy this type of content, remember to like and subscribe. There's a ton to help out the channel. Keeps the videos coming. Yeah, let's start out with our top of the list here. The solo ticket out of early pool 3. I think there are really just two main cards here that you pretty much, you get them, you don't need any other pool 3 card, and you should pretty much be able to get to infinite if you play well enough and manage your snaps well. And those are Sarah and the Destroyer. So these are two of the most powerful cards in the game right now. Destroyer, very popular in an ongoing shell, though there are some other versions of it as well, with things like Bucky, Carnage, Nova. I do think the best version of that deck is an ongoing one, whether you have all the cards for it or you just have Destroyer and a bunch of pool 2 cards. And then Sarah. Sarah is showing up in so many different decks right now. She is really, really powerful. Just being able to slam Sarah on turn 5 or sometimes earlier if locations permit, and then being able to just vomit your hand with all these cheap things. A lot of times you will be playing from behind, so it helps you play around opponents' tech cards, which is pretty nice, so they can't Killmonger you, they can't really Shang-Chi you as easily, so that's usually pretty good. And she just does something that is very unique, powerful, and no other card in the game really works as a substitution for her in the decks that she cares about, and she can definitely carry a number of decks all the way to infinite with just pool 1 and pool 2 cards. Next up, we have archetype defining cards, and there are some pretty great ones here, starting out with Arrow. Arrow is showing up in kind of everything here. Now, some of these images are a little outdated in terms of the power. Arrow is 8 power now. Some of these are from the beta. Things were a little bit differently, but overall, Arrow, really, really top tier card right now. Seeing play in a ton of different decks, and the ability to just kind of move your opponent's stuff into a lane where they don't want it to be moved to help close out the game is something that really few other cards do anywhere near as well. So really cool card, and I definitely think she is defining in a lot of archetypes. Next up, we have Death. Death, kind of the same thing. Death isn't really replaceable in the decks that run her, mainly the Death Arrow, Death Wave, those kind of decks that care about destroy effects. She's just an amazing payoff, and there's really nothing else that kind of works the same way she does, especially with things like Wave that allow you to slam Death and another card like Arrow, or just another big value creature when the opponent can usually only play one card a turn, or for that turn. And then Dracula. Dracula is a huge part of why discard is good right now. He has a very unique effect that is hard to deal with. You can't silence it with Enchantress. You can't Shang-Chi him because it happens at the end of the game. And if you play the deck right, you're always going to be discarding something big, so he can help you win a lane guaranteed a lot of the time. And and there's very little your opponent can usually do to deal with that. So very powerful card, huge reason why the discard archetype is good. Magic, this is actually a card that got nerfed in the beta, but still very, very powerful, changing one of the locations to make it so there is a turn 7 this game. This is really defining in decks that have a lot of big stuff or sometimes more control-y shells, as you want that additional time and you're kind of planning your game plan around the fact that you have this extra turn when your opponent usually is going to have a deck that isn't really designed to take advantage of that final turn. Very unique and powerful effect, and just definitely defines a bunch of the decks that do run her. Dr. Doom. So this one is a mainstay in a few different archetypes, but he's just so good. Definitely Storm decks really appreciate this card. Things like even decks that kind of go tall with things like Devil Dino really appreciate this because it helps you kind of sneakily fight for lanes the opponent might not expect you to be fighting for. You can go wide rather than just going tall and do it at the same time. Also on reveal decks and Jubilee decks I think also really appreciate this card. He's just one of the best 6-cost things in the game in my opinion, and he makes a lot of decks better for having him in them and just lends himself very well to the strategy a lot of them are trying to employ. Then we have Lockjaw. So Lockjaw, 2 main archetypes we see Lockjaw in. One is a Thor deck that tries to cheat a bunch of big stuff into play. Big fan of that deck, but it can definitely be a little bit RNG because sometimes you hit the big stuff, sometimes you don't. But the real place Lockjaw has been seeing a ton of play, and where I think he's definitely an archetype defining card, even though he is also that in the Thor deck, is the new Lockjaw discard deck. Being able to just trigger your discard effects over and over again by swapping stuff out in your deck when your deck has a critical mass of discard is incredibly powerful. I think he and Dracula are really the biggest reasons why discard is having a lot of success right now. They are just very, very powerful cards and allow you to discard your hand, get payoff, get big stuff to close out the game, and have a decent amount of smaller stuff to populate the board as well. So very, very powerful card, and I think we're going to be seeing a lot more of him. Mystique. So this is definitely an archetype defining card. Mainly you see her in the Patriot decks, but she's also really good in things like the on reveal deck with Wong, who we'll talk about in a minute, as well as some combo decks like the kind of Exodia combo deck where you blow up all your opponent's stuff. That's a pretty interesting one. She's just a very, very good card when you're playing a deck that has a lot of ongoing effects, and very reasonably costed. Also a mainstay in the Mr. Negative deck because she is a 0 power, so she ends up being essentially free post Mr. Negative if she's in your deck, so that's very, very strong. Just a super unique and powerful card, and the archetypes that she sees play in is a super duper big boost to what their general game plan is trying to accomplish. It makes the deck a lot more consistent. And then last of our archetype defining cards here is Wong. Wong is just everything you want to be doing in an on reveal deck. He is just so incredibly powerful with things like Tiger, Dr. Doom, now Black Panther, just really any on reveal effect. Just doubling it is so huge. You can also do silly stuff with Mystique where you play Wong into Mystique and you double the double, and things just start getting really out of hand really fast. You've probably seen some clips already of Wong leading to some very ridiculous board states, and he's definitely a card where once you get him, even if you don't have a lot of other pool 3 cards, he's very good because he's great on his own. Even though he defines a lot of archetypes, he is one of the cards here that I would say you can just slot him into a deck of mostly pool 1 and pool 2 cards, and you'll still probably have a very decent amount of success with him. Not quite as much as Sarah or Destroyer. I do think those are in kind of a tier of their own, but I don't think Wong is too far away from them, because he just really doesn't need a lot of specific support to be good, even though he definitely benefits from it. All right, moving on to our great on their own section. Quite a few cards here, so I'm going to try and go through these a little bit faster. because there are a lot of cards in pool 3 and we want to get through them all here. Daredevil, just super unique effect, absolutely backbreaking with things like Professor X and Hobgoblin. Just being able to guarantee you know what your opponent's going to do can also help you snap on turn 5 before the end of the game, because you know what they're going to do, so you can kind of plan out your game plan to know if you're going to win or lose the game. And no other card in the game does what he does. So he's also a unique effect where it's not ongoing, so it can't be removed by Enchantress. So I believe you do need him on the field in order to actually get the effect. So if you eat him to Carnage or he gets blown up some other way, you don't actually get the effect just by having played him. But super unique, super powerful, and I think we're going to be continuing to see a lot of Daredevil, especially with Professor X. Black Panther, so our new Season Pass card here. Black Panther is just a very good card, I think. Like, I wouldn't say he's top tier without more support, but he is good enough to where you can run him with a very limited number of support and still generate good results, especially in Pool 1 and Pool 2. You can really just get by in a typical on-reveal shell, and using Odin to boost him up again the final turn, as well as trigger other on-reveal effects, is really good. Obviously, he's a lot better with things like Wong and Zola that really make him shine, so he does benefit a lot from Pool 3 support, but he is still a strong enough card where he stands pretty solidly on his own. Captain Marvel, super unique effect, really cool. You definitely have to learn a little bit about how to play around with it, because there are some strange interactions sometimes with how she works, but she wins you. If she can win you the game by moving, she will, most of the time at least. There are a few instances that get weird, but very, very good card. You see her play in some more control-y type of decks, or decks where you see things like Mysterio, where you're trying to keep your opponent guessing as to which of the lanes you're going to be fighting for, so then she can kind of catch them off guard and win a lane they weren't expecting you to win at the end of the game. So very powerful and just slots into a lot of different decks. Green Goblin, same kind of thing, just a very good disruption effect. A lot of times players will fill up a lane with, 2 or even 3 units, and they're expecting to leave that last spot blank. That way, your opponent can't just know, hey, they only have this much power, so I know how much I have to beat them. They try and keep you guessing, but Green Goblin can just absolutely solo a lane by locking up that 4th spot and making the opponent unable to play any more cards there. Super powerful, and especially for the cost, I think he just makes a lot of sense in a ton of different decks. Juggernaut's a pretty cool one. Very, very good in the storm shells. Basically makes your opponent's stuff, if they played it there that turn, move to somewhere else. It's just another very unique and good effect where if you're really trying to lock down a lane and your opponent's also fighting for the lane, Juggernaut can just say no, and there's really not much they can do about it. Leader. This is one of my favorite 6-cost cards in the game. If you're ahead, he keeps you ahead a lot of the time. There are some exceptions, but generally, the cool thing about Leader is you play him, you get copies of the cards your opponent played this turn, and that's usually enough to close out the game a lot of the time. You have to be careful with Leader because of positioning. You really want to kind of mirror what your opponent is doing, leave a similar amount of board space, so that way you actually get full Leader value. But if you have board space and you're beating your opponent on turn 5, Leader usually is good enough to seal the game on turn 6. Then Magneto, another one of my favorite 6-cost cards in the game. Another very unique and powerful effect, kind of like Arrow, where we're moving our opponent's cards, and he has a big power as well on top of that. It's just really great, especially against like Storm decks, to be able to rip their 3 and 4 cost stuff from other lanes. This is also pretty good against Destroyer decks, and kind of make their Ant-Man go offline. They have a lot of 3 and 4 costs, so you can kind of rip those out and mess up their total power. And there's not really another card in the game that does something like that to the same effect as Magneto. So really big fan of that one. Mojo, seen a lot of play in the ongoing Destroyer deck, but he does see play in some Zoo variants as well. Just a very solid card. Kind of forces your opponent to not fill up a location, otherwise he becomes a 2-cost 8 power, which is really, really insane. And you can also sometimes drop him as kind of a surprise, where when you know the opponent's going to fill up a lane, you can drop him and maybe something else, you fill it too, and then you get that bonus, and there's usually not a lot they can do about that. Mysterio. This is one of my favorite cards in the game. So you get 2 other copies played at different locations. They all show up as 0 power, and at the end of the game, Mysterio is revealed, which is the real one. This is nice because it gives you some destruction fodder for things like Carnage, as well as other just general destroy effects that you want to be destroying stuff to get your death down. But I really love the mind games this card creates. You know, it keeps your opponent guessing, and 5 power for 2 cost is a very, very good rate. But the downside is obviously you are filling up your board more. So sometimes those 0 power Mysterio copies can be not good for you. But if you manage it correctly, I think the card is very, very powerful and just slots in a lot of different decks. Polaris. This is another one kind of like Arrow. I think she and Arrow are 2 of the best kind of disruption cards in the game. Just moving I believe 1 or 2 cost card around. Also good power for the cost. And anytime you're just like disrupting your opponent's board, it just seems so powerful. Because a lot of people don't think to play around that or try and play around that, and then you really catch them off guard, and sometimes that can be enough to just totally swing the game around, especially against things that care about having a full lane like Ant-Man. Rescue. This is another one that slots into a lot of different shells. Just a good power for the cost, but you do obviously need to play another card in that lane to get that full power, buffing her up from 4 to 9. She is in Shang-Chi range, so you have to be a little bit careful of that. But I do like her a lot. I think she is one of the best 4 cost in the game and slots into a lot of different decks because there aren't like a ton of great 4 cost right now, in my opinion. And Wave. Wave is just kind of an irreplaceable card in the right deck, and she goes into a lot of different decks. She really helps enable you to play decks that are very top heavy, as you can cheat out a big thing as early as turn 4, sometimes earlier with other locations or support, but generally turn 4. Also, one of the main reasons Agatha is kind of still a playable card, even though she's not insanely great, because Agatha will always play herself. So if you wave into Agatha, then you gain back control and you get a big 14 power down. Just a really cool, unique effect. It's also good because if your opponent is a deck that cares about throwing a lot of stuff down late on in the game, you can just slam Wave. They're limited to generally 1 card. Great interaction with Death, to where you can usually play Death for 0 and another card. Just super unique, super powerful, and I think might be the best Season Pass card we've ever had, as she was on the Season Pass in the beta. But she is available in Pool 3, obviously. Then we have Giganto. This is a card I really like. This is one of my favorite big cards. Now, it does have a restriction. You can only play it in the left lane, but a lot of shells that run Giganto are using it as kind of a reanimation effect with Ghost Rider or Hela, or cheating it into play with Jubilee or other cards like that. And sometimes you just play it on the left lane for 14 power, and that gets you there too. So just a very good, kind of generic big thing, but I think one of the better big cards in the game, because its restriction isn't as limiting as the biggest card in the game, Infinite. Then we have the Hood. This one slots into a ton of different decks. Definitely sees the most play in destroy decks because we have an easy way to destroy it, as well as just make use of that cheap 1 cost 6 power demon. But he sees play in control decks. He sees play in like almost everything. He's just one of the best 1-drops, I think, in the game because of the 1-drop that he gives you, being such an above rate power for cost, and it's very easy to destroy him. So there's really not too much downside with that negative power. Then we have Debris, just a very good disruption card. Much like Green Goblin, you can kind of lock your opponent out of lanes, and there's not really much they can do about it, which is pretty sweet. On top of that, she's really good in the Patriot deck, as the rocks can get buffed by your Patriot, buffed by your Blue Marvel. Just, you can take advantage of the rocks while your opponent generally cannot. So I think that makes her very powerful in both Patriot and just general disruption type of decks. Moving on to our next tier here. Great with support. And we have even more cards here, so I'm going to try and speed it up a little bit. Zola. Zola is just very good in decks that try and make a really big thing or take advantage of the on-reveal effects. Most notably, he has been boosted a lot with the addition of Black Panther, as if you use him on Black Panther, you get the copies of Panther, who then double again, and that can actually be pretty hard to beat. But you do have to watch out for counter effects, kind of like Cosmo and Armor, as he is a destroy effect. Cerebro is a really cool one. Generally, Cerebro, you're trying to make a deck that has all of the same power, so Cerebro buffs all those different things at the same time. You copy the buff with Mystique, and that turns your board of 2 power things into 6 power, which is really, really cool. There are different power levels of Cerebro across like all the powers. It's just a really fun build around card and can be very powerful with the right support. Red Skull's a neat one of the highest power cards in the game, but has a pretty big drawback for giving your opponent's stuff in that lane +2. You use this generally in 0 shells or things where you're not worried about your opponent playing to a lane, but generally 0 decks where you can negate that effect are the place where it sees the most play. Also things like Dracula, where you can discard it to gain the power. Mr. Negative. So Negative was actually nerfed super heavily in the beta. He used to be a 4 power, now he's -1 power. And the main reason for this is he makes your 0 power cards have 0 cost and have good power. You can also tutor those cards with Jane Foster, who we'll talk about in a bit. And it's just pretty silly. You see this a lot in Sarah Miracle decks, where you're running Sarah to reduce the cost, and you're running Magic to get an extra turn, so you're like drawing all your cards, and it's just very, very silly some of the stuff they can do on the final turn of the game when they have a lot of 0 cost, very powerful effects like Iron Man, like Iron Heart, Mystique, the list goes on. Colleen Wing. This is one of the best cards in the discard deck because she helps guarantee you're going to discard your Swarm. Also above average power for cost. Just a very good card and kind of a very needed addition to the discard deck in Pool 3, as we just want as many discard effects as we can, and she's one of the best ones for cost in the game. Falcon. So this one is bouncing your 1-drops. There are a few decks that really utilize this heavily. There are some movement decks that are pretty cool. Helps you protect your stuff against Killmonger, which is very nice, and you can kind of, grow things like your Human Torch, bring it back to hand, and then just set it down on the final turn so you can avoid a lot of destroy effects, get a lot of small stuff down at once, which is good for things like Bishop. It's generally pretty good card overall. Brood mainly sees play in the Patriot deck, just because you're throwing a bunch of cards with essentially no effect text in one lane, and then getting a buff from Patriot and Mystique and Blue Marvel and all that stuff. So just one of the really good cards in the Patriot deck. Doesn't see a ton of play elsewhere. Hellcat, another very good discard card. Discarding 2 cards is really good. Decent power. Just really, really core to both the regular discard deck, the Lockjaw deck, Hella. Anything where you're trying to discard a lot of cards, you want to have Hellcat if you have it. Human Torch. This definitely has been kind of carrying the movement archetype in Pool 3. It's one of the best move cards in the game. It's so cheap, you can kind of weave it in during a lot of different turns. You can also just make it cheaper by returning it to hand with something like Beast, or protecting it with Falcon to get it down again, and more movement stuff with things like Iron Fist. Just a very good card, and a big reason why movement has decent success in Pool 3. Deadpool, super powerful build around card. This is one I really wish I had. The Death Pool archetype is really powerful and fun, and has a lot of ways to grow your Deadpool, destroy him, make him bigger, copy him, just do a lot of silly stuff to get some really, really big Deadpools to close out the game. Dagger, she got buffed recently, so now she's seeing play a lot more in Pool 3 movement decks. Just a generally pretty good card. She was actually really bad before she got buffed, but now the fact that she accounts for cards your opponent has played but haven't revealed yet has made her a lot more viable in the movement shell. Beast, just a good card at bouncing your stuff back to hand. Generally played in kind of cheaper swarm decks where, especially with Bishop, where you want to play all these cards out, you get benefits from it, on real effects, all that stuff. Get it back to your hand for cheaper. You can do it all over again. Good at dodging removal from things like Killmonger. Just a pretty good card overall. Invisible Woman, huge key card here for the Hela decks, as Hela decks can be very prone to RNG, and being able to hide all your discard cards and then Hela behind her, so they all go off at the end of the game, so you're pretty much guaranteed to know what you're going to discard and what Hela's going to bring back, is a huge part of what makes the archetype pretty strong. Other than that, she usually doesn't see a ton of play in other decks, but wouldn't be surprised if she saw more play over time, because I think the effect is very powerful. Ghost Rider mainly sees play in Hela and Agatha decks, just decks where you're trying to cheat something big into play after discarding it. Very core for that strategy, but definitely not quite as good as he used to be after getting nerfed from 3 to 4 energy, but still a powerful card with a unique effect that there aren't many ways of doing something like that in the current game. Goose, this is just such a good resource denial card where, you know, if your opponent especially is playing a more top-end heavy deck, you can just shut them out of lanes entirely. This card can just solo some decks. Just insanely powerful, and as long as you build your deck to play around it, I think you should have a lot of success with it. Electro, so one of our best ramp cards here along with Wave, just giving you +1 energy for the rest of the game, but you can only play 1 card a turn. Now if you have a way to destroy him, that can be pretty good, because then you can play more stuff, but usually you're just playing big stuff with Electro. You're not really worried about the limitation, because you're not trying to vomit your hand out. Gambit, this one is used kind of in some combo decks. Doesn't see a ton of play in discard, but decent discard card. One of the kind of unconditional removals we have in the game, but the target is random, obviously. Mainly sees play in the Exodia combo deck, where you're able to repeat this effect numerous times over and over and blow up your opponent's board. So that is kind of a meme-y combo that is hard to pull off. It's really cool when it works. Hela, just the key card to her own archetype of discard big things, cheat them back into play. I think the other version of discard focusing around Lockjaw is better, but Hela can be certainly very fun and very powerful, even though there is definitely some RNG involved with it. Jane Foster. So this card, really sick card. One of my favorite cards from Pool 3. Draws all your 0-cost cards, sees play mainly in 2 archetypes. The Thor deck, obviously, as you get to draw your 0-cost stuff. So you get your Mjolnir guaranteed, which is very nice. And Mr. Negative, as you can curve Mr. Negative into Jane Foster, draw all your 0-cost cards, and that can usually help you guarantee the win on the final turn. Maximus, this is a card I didn't think was very good initially, but is actually kind of awesome. Mainly sees play in the Sarah shells, as getting him down on the final turn for only 2 cost after Sarah. For 7 power, you don't really care that you're giving your opponent 2 cards most of the time, because they're not going to be able to play those cards. Also pretty good with effects that deny the on-reveal effects, like Cosmo. Just a pretty powerful card for the rate, if you can manage to mitigate the downside. Moon Knight, absolutely core card in the discard deck, in my opinion. Being able to not only do something you want to do, which is discard one of your cards, but discard one of your opponent's cards, which can sometimes totally screw over their game plan, is just a super unique, powerful effect, and we don't really see many other things that do something like that in the game yet. Miles Morales SpiderMan, good in the move deck, doesn't really see play a whole ton elsewhere, but I would not be surprised if this card got a bit better as more movement tools are printed, as I think move is viable but a little bit underpowered at the moment. Patriot, very key card for the Patriot decks, obviously. Now, you can succeed with Patriot without other Pool 3 support, but he really shines when you get other cards to support him. So I think he definitely justifies the slot in this category, as Patriot is a pretty high tier deck once you have all the necessary pieces. Psylocke is a very good ramp card. Helps us get to turn 4 on turn 3, or get out a 6 cost on 5 and do another 6. There are only a few ramp cards in the game, and she's just one of them. As long as you have, good payoff for cheating stuff out, 1 energy ahead of curve, she can be a very useful inclusion in the deck. Quinjet. This mainly sees play in the Dino variant in Pool 3, because you're generating a lot of cards to your hand. Quinjet reduces them. Pretty powerful card there. Also sees play in some of the bounce decks with Falcon and Beast, as bouncing the cards will get you a Quinjet reduction. So that's pretty cool. Pretty powerful card, but definitely only slots into a few specific archetypes. Rogue. Rogue is a cool one. She basically steals an ongoing effect from your opponent in the lane. Another kind of unique effect here. Kind of a big tech card, but if you're seeing a lot of ongoing stuff, especially like Dino, this can be a pretty powerful thing. Just steal their Dino effect, make them only have a 3 power, and then you get the benefit, or really just against any powerful ongoing effect that you don't want your opponent to have access to, but definitely kind of a tech card rather than a build around archetype. Typhoid Mary, just big power for the cost, but you have a downside, and Zero helps mitigate that downside, so sees a lot of play in the Red Skull Zero decks. Thor, obviously the key piece of the Thor decks. Good with general on reveal stuff, because you can get multiple Mjolnirs into the deck. You can trigger the Mjolnir multiple times. Obviously very good with Wong and Jane, and in the Lockjaw shell, but doesn't see a whole ton of play elsewhere. He's definitely a deck you're going to be building around a lot if you include him. Ultron, I really like this card a lot, but the main place he sees play right now is the Patriot decks. Sometimes you'll see him in a zoo list as well, but I don't think he's really that great there. Mainly Patriot decks, because you get that 8 power, then you get to fill up your other locations with 1/1s with no text. Those 1 power guys get buffed by your Patriot and other buff effects, and it can definitely help close out the game and refill after you have gotten some of your other 1 cost stuff killmongered. Venom. So this is a very key card in the kind of Deadpool, Taskmaster, some death decks. Also, just generally stuff where you want to be destroying your own cards and getting benefit from it. Venom's just very good at doing that, and kind of similar to Carnage, but definitely more build around than Carnage, because he's gaining power of everything you destroy, so you generally want to destroy stuff that has high power and get good value from that. Very powerful if you make copies of it, but generally good card, just needs some very specific support to make the most of it. Zero, just very good in the kind of turn off your bad effect stuff with Red Skull and Typhoid Mary. Pretty irreplaceable card there, as you really want a way to shut off your stuff, and Zero is kind of the most effective way of doing that while just weaving it into your curve. Taskmaster, very good in death decks, Venom decks, all that kind of stuff. Just anything where you're playing a really high amount of power, and then you can just follow it up with Taskmaster to copy that power. Really good in unique effect. And then SpiderMan, generally good in the lane denial type of decks. He's just good at shutting your opponent down so they can't play cards somewhere. They can still add cards through other methods, but sometimes just not letting them play a card somewhere, especially if you're on turn 5 going into turn 6, can just be enough to see out the game. Definitely good with other lane denial stuff like Storm, Juggernaut, Goose, etc. Then we have our niche cards. So niche, I think some of these cards are currently finding a home, but they are pretty unpopular overall. So we will just go over them quickly here. Adam Warlock mainly sees play in some combo decks. They're trying to draw their whole deck, as well as there are zoo variants that try and play some big power early on, or a bunch of power through small stuff and draw with Adam, but doesn't see a whole ton of play. Agatha's really cool. She's a fun card to mess around with, one of the most unique cards in the game, but she definitely has a huge amount of randomness to her, much like Ego, and that obviously makes the deck not very consistent. So she's kind of a niche card, but she can be very fun to play, and I think the people that do like her play a ton of her because she's just such a unique and interesting effect. Dr. Octopus. This is one where you see it sometimes in kind of weird resource denial kind of decks, but I don't think he's actually that great because he pulls basically all the stuff from their hand into the location, fills it as much as he can. It's good if you're already playing for a location that's pretty full, but it's very risky because you never know what your opponent's going to have in hand, especially if there are a lot of spaces on the board for them to get filled by Dr. Octopus. Hazmat, mostly a combo card, reduces the power of, I think, all other cards by -1. Mainly see this in things that are repeating the effect over and over again. There's some funny clips out there of people having like negative thousands of power, so kind of an Exodia deck thing like Gambit, but mostly Mimi. Doesn't really have a home in a very good deck right now. Kingpin, pretty cool card. I think it's seeing a little bit more play now that Arrow and Magneto are being recognized as being super powerful, but if stuff moves to where he is on turn 6, he destroys them. Cool, unique effect. I like it quite a bit, but I do think that it is very conditional, and if you aren't drawing your cards that move stuff around into that lane to get advantage, he's just not very good. Omega Red, another cool card here where you are kind of incentivized for getting really ahead in one lane, and Omega Red boosts your other lanes. It's only boosting by 4 power though, so I think it's kind of easy to play around this card, and the requirement is very, very high of having to have a lead of 10 power. Maybe if you can kind of lock your opponent out of the lane somehow, he can be good, but I have not had a whole ton of success with him trying him out. Rock Slide just shuffles, I think it's 2 rocks into your opponent's deck. It's just a bad rate for cost. I mean, 6 power for 4 energy isn't particularly great. Also, you'll be later in the game when you're playing this, so there's a good chance your opponent already drew the cards that they want, and they have a smaller chance of drawing the rocks. So even though there are 2 of them, I think Korg is a lot better way to go if you want to be rocking your opponent. Ronin, this is seeing some like niche play in decks that, you know, force your opponent to draw cards. I don't think it's a particularly great strategy, though sometimes it can work, and it can be a handy counter sometimes against Dino decks that keep their hand very full. But I think he's just a bit too niche, and 5 cost is quite a lot for the effect, when a lot of decks really aren't going to be making him very big by having a kind of medium to small hand size. Drax. I don't understand why Drax is in pool 3. All the other Guardians of the Galaxy are in pools, I think, 1 and 2. And I just don't really get why this is here. Drax is kind of underwhelming. He's not terrible, he's playable, but I don't think he's particularly great. And he's definitely a card I would like to see buffed, or at the very least moved down to one of the earlier pools. Viper, kind of a disruption card. You can use this with things like the Hood, or things like Electro, kind of just give them a card in your lane. You're giving them a card that is not very good. You could also tempo it on 2, but you might as well play a card with a better effect at that point. But definitely see some niche play and disruption style stuff. Wasp mainly sees play in the Lockjaw decks as a free way to trigger Lockjaw. Also gets drawn off of Jane Foster, but doesn't really have much of a home outside of there. Yellow Jacket mainly sees play in the Cerebral decks. Doesn't really see play anywhere else other than 2 power Cerebro. And Black Widow, just another kind of disruption effect. There, are some decks that do try and disrupt quite a bit, and Black Widow's a decent way of doing that. But I do think if you're going for disruption, it is one of the weaker effects, at least with the current amount of support. And then not played. There are only a few cards here, but I think these are some of the worst cards in the game right now. So apologies if you get this early on in your pool 3 journey. Black Cat, obviously decent power for the cost, but a very, very heavy downside of this is in your card, or if this is in your hand at the end of the turn, you discard this card. Some people run it in Hela. I think Hela is a bit too tight of a list to justify this inclusion. Going down a card or just getting a 6 power at the end of the game potentially doesn't seem worth it to me when you can discard better stuff, and you also want more discard cards in your hand to discard the better stuff. So don't really like that. Black Bolt discards your opponent's lowest cost card. That just seems like it's asking a lot in terms of cost for an effect that isn't that great. I feel like you want to be discarding, you know, their big thing at the end of the game, not their smallest thing, because I think a lot of the times they're not going to be playing that smallest thing, and the power you get from it just is pretty mediocre. Nick Fury, maybe this is one that'll get more support later on, but you get 2 6 costs to your hand. The rate's not terrible, and maybe you could try this in like Dino or something. I do think it's one of the more underwhelming cards we've gotten from the season passes so far. Baron Mordo. This one sees play in that kind of disruption style deck with Viper and things that and Ronin, where you're like forcing your opponent to draw cards. Sometimes it can be decent, you know, setting one of their low cost cards to 6 just makes it so that you are not able to, or they're not able to actually play their card, or if they do, they have to kind of waste their whole turn, which is definitely a downside, but it's just kind of too niche. Crystal, I think Crystal's actually like the worst card in the game. I don't think I've ever seen anybody play this card, not even once, and I hope she gets a buff, because she does not seem very good. Crossbones, a lot of 4-drops are kind of underwhelming, with the exception of a few like Rescue and Jessica Jones and whatnot. Crossbones, definitely one of those, kind of a win more card. You have to be ahead to play him there, and he doesn't even have that insane of a rate for the downside of his effect. And then Quake mainly sees play in the 3-power Cerebral versions, but the effect is just kind of mediocre. Sometimes it can be good, but you don't really know how the locations are going to get shuffled up, so sometimes it doesn't even work out kind of how you want it to. So just a bit too random of an effect for the power you're getting out of this cost. But yeah, those are all of the cards in Pool 3. That's our tier list here. Hopefully it provided some insight. If you want to take a look at the list yourself, I will have a link to it in the description where you can take a look at all the cards. I'm curious what you think. Do you have cards on here you agree with, disagree with, all that stuff? Let me know in the comments. Definitely happy to discuss it. But hopefully this provides a decent frame of reference where you open a card from Pool 3. This will hopefully give you a bit of an idea of, hey, is this card good? Is this card bad? Will I find a home for this card immediately? Does it need support? All that kind of stuff. But that's going to wrap it up for this video. If you enjoyed it, remember to like and subscribe, and I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.